I'm the director of the MFA program here at UC Riverside. Maggie Downs is our director of marketing, and Dr. John Martin Fischer is distinguished professor of philosophy at the University of California, Riverside, and also a university professor at the University of California, which means he literally can do no wrong. There's nothing he can do at the University of California that would cause him to lose his job.
That means I can't do anything wrong without being, I mean, I can do things wrong without being punished. That's what it is.
Right. Which is the level that Maggie and I are angling to get to very soon.
Yes.
And that's why we're here with John as well. So this book actually came out a summer ago.
Yes.
So just under a year ago. And I can't imagine, John, that you thought that the world was going to look like as it does. What do you make of this time in our lives?
Yeah, it's crazy. I think what a time to be talking about immortality.
What a time to be alive.
Yeah. And, if I got in my philosophical time machine and zoomed back a couple months, it would be totally different. We would be talking about how this is a great time to be thinking about greater and greater longevity, and even in some way to be aiming at some kind of immortality. There have been a lot of advances in anti-aging medicine and extraordinary leaps. 100 years ago, the average lifespan was 40 years in developed countries, in Western developed countries. And at the turn of the 21st century, it was 80 years. And we're making all sorts of advances. Mm-hmm. But we always knew that with the advances we're making, new problems crop up, and new viruses crop up, and new bacteria that are invulnerable to our previous antibiotics. And so now we're going through a really difficult period. There are people in Silicon Valley and the Russian plutocrats who are very optimistic about our chances for achieving some kind of immortality. I think it's interesting to think about it. Mm. And to maybe try to do things to enhance our longevity, but I'm also a realist about it, and I think a time like this brings out that we have tremendous challenges.
Well, and I don't know if I'd want to live the rest of eternity with this level of rage.
No.
so
I do want to live forever, but I want to look 30 while doing it.
Yeah.
So
right.
If you can tell me that.
Well, I think you do now, at least.
Well, and so that's the existential question, or it's not even the existential question, it's the tangible question of already our bodies can't keep up with our minds, mm-hmm. right? That we keep mental acuity longer than we keep physical acuity.
If we're lucky.
If we're lucky, right. And so the advances that you're talking about, the things that these scientists believe are in our future that might preserve our bodies, have they figured out how they can preserve our minds as well?
Well, I don't think anyone has a, let's say, a cure for Alzheimer's or other kinds of dementia, or a way of, a clear way of avoiding them or pushing them back. But there is a lot of work now on Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia, and trying to figure out ways to push them back, if not reverse them or get rid of them entirely. There's a researcher named Dale Bredesen who's written an interesting book called The End of Alzheimer's, and he's involved with a group of doctors, including Peter Attia and others, who are looking into dietary and lifestyle ways of trying to preserve cognitive functioning and to, as it were, put off Alzheimer's. Now, it's nothing is yet for sure, but people are addressing those issues, and there's some hope. We're talking about not wanting to live under circumstances like this, and when we think about longevity, greater longevity, or we think even about immortality, sometimes we think, gosh, we've seen elderly people, and some of us are rapidly approaching that point, where our bodies are deteriorating and our minds are deteriorating, and it's painful, and it's not a pleasant life. And then we extrapolate and we think, gosh, I wouldn't want to live like that, where I'm getting more and more dilapidated and my body's falling apart. But I think what Maggie was asking about is this thought experiment that some philosophers like, and that is, if you could imagine that your body was not biologically deteriorating and your mind wasn't deteriorating, and you lived in relatively favorable circumstances, a relatively clean environment and so forth. So it's a hypothetical question, but if all those were true, would you want to live forever? Right. And philosophers have thought about that. There's a contemporary philosopher, Bernard Williams, who's passed away now, but relatively modern philosopher, who talked a lot about an opera that was written by Janacek, based on a play by Karl Capek, in which there was a character, Alina Macropolis, who was given an elixir of eternal life. Well, what it was, her father had developed this elixir that allowed someone to live 300 years without biological deterioration. And she took it when she was 37. So the play and the opera take place when she's 337, but she has the body and the mind, the brain of a 37-year-old. And the question is whether she should take it again. And she decides not to, because her life is boring and she's alienated. She's not interested in anything. Everything's the same, as she says, and so she gives it up. But that's the question that I think, at least the thought problem that's interesting. What if we could solve the environmental challenges? What if we could remain healthy? Would we want then to choose to live forever? And that's an interesting question. I think philosophers have been curmudgeons about this. We've been very skeptical. Going back to Plato, when he was sentenced to death, his comforters came to him the night before and they said, don't worry, it's not going to be so bad. And he said, stop, I'm looking forward to this. Our world is a transitory world, and everything's changing and contradictory. I want to live in the pure world of the forms, Plato's heaven, they called it. But in other words, escaping this reality was thought to be desirable. And most philosophers have thought that death gives meaning to life, that we wouldn't choose to live forever. So there's a raging debate in contemporary philosophy about this, and I am on the side that's a little less pessimistic about it. I don't know if I'd call myself an optimist. I call myself a realist, but I'm not a curmudgeon. I think that under certain circumstances, I definitely would want to live forever.
Well, and you bring up a lot of great questions about this, which we'll go through some of them. I just want to remind the viewers. So Daniel, I see your hand is up. If you have a question, go ahead and click over to the Q&A section down there at the bottom of your screen. Type your question out, and at the conclusion of Maggie and my conversation with the professor, we'll take a bunch of the questions and post them to the professor. I'm sure Maggie has some thoughts about Alzheimer's, because Maggie's new book, which comes out next week, and we'll be talking to Maggie on May 13th about her book, which has a great deal to do with Alzheimer's, is about going on the journey of that her mother couldn't go on because she had Alzheimer's.
Yes.
So you must have some thoughts about that life if you're stuck with that condition.
Oh, it's terrible. My mother now has some kind of dementia. I'm not sure whether it's Alzheimer's, and it's very painful and difficult and sad. And because our memories really are who we are, or they stitch us together over time.
Well, that was one of the things that I really grappled with was, is this still my mom?
Right.
If she doesn't remember me, if she doesn't remember herself, like, who is she? Who is this person? So, right. And that's something that I don't think there is an answer to that.
Right. And I think that it's interesting because if you were to live forever, presumably you would at some point not remember anything about yourself now.
Right.
And you would have very different values. And some people think, well, you'd be a different person. And so it's not really being immortal. It's not the story of yourself living forever. But I think let's just take not someone who suffers from dementia, but just a regular person like you and me. For instance, I don't have any memories of myself when I was 3 years old. I just don't. I don't even have any of myself when I was 5. Now, my parents have shown me photos of a little boy in Cleveland, Ohio. He was all wrapped up because it was cold and snowy. That was me, but I don't have any memories of that point.
But your parents do, and
yeah, my parents do.
And so that's sort of an interesting thing, because it ties into one of these larger questions in your book, which is essentially, what is the meaning of life?
Right.
I mean, it's in the title. And if you're a nihilist,
I had to do that.
if you're a nihilist, what you're feeling is irrelevant until you talk to your parents and they have a memory of you before you have a memory of you. And then there's presumably some level of missing. Like, I don't even know that person that I was, and these other people do. That would mess with your nihilism.
Well,
we're blowing heads out over here.
There are lots of different issues here, and I wanted to go back to Maggie's point, and that is, so in our ordinary lives, as we lead them, we lose our memories, and we're always losing memories. Sometimes I don't remember where I put my glasses 5 minutes ago, but I definitely don't have any memories of myself when I lived in Cleveland, Ohio, though I trust my parents that I did. But I'm still the same person. But now, someone with Alzheimer's or other forms of dementia, they lose memories in a different way. It's not the ordinary way in which our minds stitch us together through memories over time. There's a more a radical discontinuity or a deterioration that's not like the normal losing of memories. And I don't know exactly what the difference is, or I don't know how to characterize the difference. All I know is that I remember a lot of what happened yesterday and to me. And yesterday I remembered a lot of what happened to me the day before and so forth. So it's like a chain where the links are memories. And though the link at one end is not directly connected to the link at the other end, there are all the intermediate links that make me a chain. Wittgenstein had the metaphor of a rope, where there's not one strand, but the different strands connect. That's the way memory works. Now, it breaks down in dementia, and that raises all sorts of questions about personal identity, and I don't know exactly how to answer them either. I know that well, I don't know the answer to who the individual is anymore. I do know that it would not be a life that I would choose.
Right.
I'm curious about your studies and your research with immortality, and I'm curious if there is one type of person who is seeking this out, and like, who are the people who want to live forever, and is it everyday people, or is it one type of person?
Good question. Well, when you look around, and without doing a lot of probing or philosophical questioning, the people who tend to want it are the wealthy and the privileged people, and a lot of the Silicon Valley billionaires and the Russian plutocrats, and they are looking at creative and sometimes kind of extreme ways of enhancing their longevity and even achieving a kind of immortality. Some of them have even arranged for cryogenic preservation of their bodies just as they're dying, and just at the moment that they die, then the people in the room next door whom they've arranged to get the body and freeze it, and then the hope is that at some future time when we've solved the relevant biological issues, they will be thought out. Now, that's an extreme kind of a dream, you could say, a fantasy, but it's real in the sense that people do it. But interestingly, one of the projects that we funded in the Immortality Project looked at this question, at least compared religious people with non-religious people, and compared males with females. And it turns out, in general, the non-religious people are much more interested in living forever. That makes sense because if you're a religious person, at least in the monotheistic Judeo-Christian Muslim tradition, and you're pretty confident that you've been a good person, then when you die, you actually go to the best of all possible places. You go to heaven, you have some kind of, right, no, not Starbucks. You go to, you go to a place where you have communion with God.
Right.
And there are different pictures of exactly what that communion is, but it's an ecstatic, wonderful existence. But but if you're not religious, there's more of a desire to live forever because you might well believe that when you die, there's nothing. Now, the other interesting thing that they noticed, these researchers, were that men were much more likely to want to live forever than women. And they had some explanations that they offered, but I wasn't convinced by the explanation. I think maybe men's lives tend to be better than women's, or we are in a powerful position. We call the shots a lot, and our lives maybe are more self-realized. Now, that's, I hope, changing, and it should change, but maybe that's part of the reason why men seek or want immortality more than women.
So there's two interesting things. Well, I mean, there's a lot of interesting things in the book, but to go back to the sort of the meaning of life that would feed into the desire for immortality.
Right.
There's a passage in your book. This is on page 22. So if you buy the book tonight and you're looking for it, it's on page 22. And it was an interview with John McCain about essentially what he did to keep his mind active while he was in the Hanoi Hilton, essentially fearing for death at any given time. And of course, he had been subjected to a tremendous amount of physical and mental abuse. And the quote is, he says, "I spent a lot of time thinking about the meaning of life." And then a couple pages earlier, you talk about what a repetitive life might be. And you say, "A Zen monk lives a repetitive life doing the same chores, chanting the same mantras and so forth. Every day is the same. In the same way that every day is the same for Sisyphus." Mm-hmm. And this all reminds me of something else that Maggie and I heard recently in a wonderful book by a writer named Michael Scott Moore, who spent 3 years in captivity with Somali pirates. And the only way that he essentially kept his mind was by giving up hope. And so I'm wondering if there's something about the belief that there is a meaning, and that the repetition, even the repetition of something bad, at some point will lead to something better that leads to this idea that I might want to live forever, or that I might get out of this situation. Very
interesting. When I heard that quote from Senator John McCain, I was fascinated by it. I'm not even sure to this day exactly what it means or what we should interpret it as meaning, but I thought it was really fascinating. I have a lot of respect and admiration for him. But I think what he was saying is, at a time like that, you try and step back and figure out what's important and what's not. You've been stripped of your dignity and your wife, your spouse, your children, your colleagues, everything. So you're just left with yourself, and you have to figure out what's valuable and what's not. And I think that, some people, philosophers tend to invoke the myth of Sisyphus, or the story of Sisyphus. He was punished by the gods, and he was required to roll a heavy rock up a hill, and then he could linger for a few minutes at the top and reflect, and then it rolled down, and then he had to do it again and forever. And it's supposed to be the paradigmatic, meaningless life. And people say it's repetitive. There's nothing that's permanent. There's no accomplishment. There's nothing but this repetition. And I was trying to figure out though, what the relationship between that and other repetitive lives. And one, I think we might think of an ascetic monk, a Christian monk, for instance, who prays every day, or a Zen Buddhist monk, and their lives are extremely repetitive, and yet I don't think we would think of them as meaningless. And I think the difference has to do with one's attitude toward what one's doing. And Sisyphus, at least when we think of him as not leading a meaningful life, is trapped in his life. He's trapped in himself. He's trapped in his life. He can't get out of it. Now, Camus himself points out that Sisyphus could achieve a kind of freedom and a kind of transcendence by scorning the gods, even though he still has to roll the rock up and down the hill. But insofar as he doesn't achieve that transcendence, he's just trapped. But the monk, let's say, or the monk, or other people who take a more kind of expansive attitude to what they're doing, use the repetition to achieve a kind of enlightenment. They're not just trapped, but they achieve a kind of greater sense, a kind of enlightenment. Now, I don't know. That's still very vague. But what I think is interesting, what many philosophers do is they start with a life that they think is really meaningless. And then they see what elements can we add to it to get to something meaningful. Mm-hmm. Some people say, well, you have to achieve something that's lasting. Or, so for instance, if Sisyphus took a different rock up every time and built a beautiful church or chapel, maybe that would make his life meaningful, or at least more meaningful. Or maybe
have a place to sit down when he got up there, at least.
That's right. as he's scorning the gods.
Right.
Or something lasting, or something that leaves a mark for others, or maybe something that connects you to something larger than yourself, something that's creative. One of the problems with Sisyphus's life is it's just not creative. So philosophers have tried to figure out what you have to add to the boring repetition to get something meaningful. And I think to tie it to immortality, if we were to live forever, I think we'd have to find projects that we're passionate about, but also have some kind of objective value. It's not just a subjective passion, because I could be very excited about counting the blades of grass in my front lawn, or counting, if you allowed me, every day I could count the number of books you have on those beautiful books. But it would be, that could be something I'm passionate about, but it doesn't add much in terms of meaning. Maybe I have a minimally meaningful life insofar as I'm passionate. But Susan Wolf is an interesting contemporary philosopher who's argued to have meaningfulness, you have to be at the intersection of subjective passion and objective value. So you have to love something that's worthy of love. And I think that Sisyphus, when you add in some sort of reaching out and not being trapped in himself, making connections with something bigger than himself, being creative, then you can kind of see the kind of life that could be meaningful. Then the question is, could we lead a meaningful life forever? And I think so. I mean, I don't see why it has to run out.
I don't have a meaningful life on a day-to-day basis.
Well, on a
Maggie had a point, I think.
Well, as you were talking about Sisyphus, that sounds a lot like my life in quarantine right now. Like every day I do the same things. But what I think is especially clever and interesting about your book is that it's not just the meaning of life. It's a switch of the prepositions there that makes it more expansive. It's not that there's one meaning and that is 42. It's that, it's meaning in life, which could be anything.
Right. As long as it is at the intersection of what I really care about and love and what's more objectively worthy of love, I think. And that's not so much my own idea, but I follow other philosophers. I have my own twist on it, but yes, I think we look for meaningfulness or meaning in our lives. And that's a much more specific idea than this vague idea that there's some meaning of all human existence. If you believe in God, and then you might think that the meaning of human life is to fulfill God's purposes for us. But apart from that, the whole idea of a meaning of the life of our species is unclear. But what's a little bit clearer, though it will still be controversial in any given case, is what do we feel adds meaningfulness to our life? Mm-hmm. And again, I think it's not written in stone somewhere, to use that, go back to Sisyphus and his rocks. It's not written in stone or in the universe what the meaning of life is, but it's our kind of consensus, our thoughtful reflection issues in a consensus. And that consensus involves creativity, being active and not just passive, not being a couch potato, but getting up and actively pursuing projects that help others, projects that lead to self-development, projects that someone outside of us could see as valuable. And I think these are the sorts of things plausibly that give meaningfulness to life. Now, I just want to say, I don't in any way want to suggest that the religious idea of living your purpose given by God, that's not an important idea or it's not valid. I'm not saying that at all. It's just, if you don't accept that framework, then you need to find some other ideas about meaningfulness in life.
Right. Well, and you talk early on in the book, and then for me at least, it's a thread that that connects everything together, particularly to your last two chapters about near-death experiences, which in fact, originally when we were going to have this talk, John was going to do a lecture on near-death experiences, but we thought that might be a little too close when that was the originally scheduled live performance. But you talk about how essentially life is, and there's a specific phrase used, but it's essentially fear management, the fear of death management. And for the two of us being me and Maggie, like this is a primary difference, I think, between the two of us. Maggie will jump out of a plane for entertainment. I don't really want to get on a plane just to get to Vegas, even. And so there's this idea that threads through this book about, in fact, when you come close to death, that fear seems to evaporate. There's a fascinating bit, I think that's in chapter 8 of the book, the study of people who have fallen from great heights and survived, about how your mental and physical acuity, start firing, and time expands, and everything, you're calm, and all these different things are happening to you.
Right.
That was, I had to stop and tell my wife, like, oh my God, like, listen to this amazing factoid.
It is amazing.
And so I'm fascinated by the fact that I live by the doctrine of fear management throughout my entire life. Maggie is, in fact, a thrill seeker.
Right.
Is there a...
But you know what, though? Okay, I just have to interject for a second, because I wouldn't say that it's seeking thrill for the pure, like, action of seeking thrill. Right. It's what you were saying, John, about, like, I feel like I am firing on all cylinders. Right. Like I am very much in the moment. I'm very present. I'm at peace, and I'm very calm.
Right.
So, and that's the only time in my life when I'm not stressed out about something else. I have to be focused in this moment.
Yeah, that's very good. That's excellent. That's similar to the idea of flow, the psychological idea of flow, when you're in a circumstance where time slows down and you're not aware of yourself so much as you're totally immersed in the situation. Quarterbacks sometimes talk about how that, they can see the receiver, everything slows down and it's natural and easy. we sometimes get those experiences, and it sounds like, I mean, there are different kinds of people with different personalities. Some are more risk averse, and some want risk and adventure. It sounds like that's something that gives you a flow experience. It's the people who love rock climbing are like that. I've often wondered, why does someone want to subject themselves to this horrible danger and just be clinging to the side of a rock? But part of it is that everything's focused, and they do achieve this sense of that they're not focused on themselves, they're not trapped in themselves. That's what I was talking about with regard to certain repetitive lives like Sisyphus's. When we think of it as meaningless, we think of him as trapped. But I think when you're having a flow experience or a spiritual experience in general through prayer or meditation, or even the ingestion of certain kinds of psychedelic substances and so forth, what happens is you get out of yourself. It's not as though the self dissolves. The Buddhists talk about the no self idea. It's not as though your self becomes nothing or dissolves. It's just that your focus is not on yourself. It's totally in the moment, present, and that's a beautiful thing. I mean, I just want to say, and I'm probably talking too much and I'll stop, but the idea that I was invoking, to which Tod referred, is the idea of terror management. And it goes back to a book by Ernest Becker called The Denial of Death. And his basic thought is we all need to protect ourselves against the anxiety and fear about death, and that psychological health involves being in denial. So we all have to be in denial about that. And that all our activities and institutions, including religion, are attempts to manage that fear. So terror management. And one of the things, though, that I think we as philosophers, he was a social scientist, we as philosophers can think more carefully about whether it makes sense to fear death at all. Because yes, if you're religious and you worry that perhaps you're going to go to hell and not to heaven, that's a reason to fear death. We fear suffering, and that's rational. But if you're not religious and you think you're going to be annihilated, and there's nothing, there won't be any experiences, positive or negative, why should you fear that? That's the worry, the question that goes all the way back to Epicurus, who was post-Aristotelian Greek philosopher. Epicurus and some of the other Hellenistic philosophers argued that we're not even there. So how can you fear a situation where you're not there to suffer at all? So anyway, terror management, but there are questions about terror management.
So specifically in this time period of, when you turn on the news and every single day, the number of dead, I mean, obviously every single day, no matter what, the number of dead people increases, right? But during a pandemic where, right now, if you're watching Rachel Maddow, instead of being here with us, she's talking about 75,000 people have died in the last 3 months from a virus. And I know for me, the month of March, for instance, when we all had to move into our homes and not leave, that terror management was a close sibling to me in this house. And I had to build a wall around the news. Like, I know intellectually there's this thing, there's an animal that's growling in the distance that can smell me, and I'm not going to go outside. And so my terror management is I'm going to recognize it. I'm not going to watch all the news. I'm going to try and save myself and save my family. But I know a lot of people who couldn't sort of intellectualize the idea of staying home and just waiting this thing out. And you see them all over the place with guns in a state house saying, I'm gonna kill this virus. Are we in that mode where terror management is being superseded by other forces?
Well, we're, I think, in a crisis. And so when we're not in a crisis, we use our institutions like religion. And, even making a lot of money and writing books, we try and become impervious to contingencies and to death. We seek fame, and we have children to keep living in a certain way, so we protect ourselves. But now we're in an extreme situation where our ordinary mechanisms don't work that well. And so I think our individual personalities and our ways of managing anxiety come out. And it's like we as individuals try and figure out what's the best way to manage this horrible fear and anxiety. I agree. I find it's a very depressing time. It's a very worrisome time. And it also worries me that so many people don't care about others enough to realize that when they're not wearing protective masks and so forth, and when they're not socially...
That affects my terror management.
Right. Yeah, exactly. It affects us. And so that's disturbing. But yeah, we each find ways. Now, some people, religion is great in many ways. And it kind of, why is there religion in every culture basically and throughout time? Because it helps to address basic human anxieties and needs, the need to figure out what will happen to us after we die, the need to find comfort, that we won't be separated from our loved ones forever, the need to feel that there's someone like a benevolent, all-powerful parental figure looking after us, the need to make sense of weird things that happen in our lives and to suffering. And so it's very important to many people. I myself am not a religious person, so I can't find comfort in those ideas. So I have to find comfort elsewhere. And I think, so actually this is one of the real lessons of near-death experiences for me. Most people, I guess, interpret them as being about the afterlife. What I think is that the main lesson is about solidarity and companionship in crises, in facing daunting challenges. So when you think about it, we come into this world, but when we come into this world, we're accompanied in a sense by our parents. And throughout our lives, we're on a journey from the known to the unknown, and we get guidance. It's very important, mentorship and guidance. Near-death experiences are about facing a very daunting and mysterious and, to some extent, frightening next part of our journey into death. But what I think is important is it shows how mentorship by loved ones, and in some cases religious figures, but usually deceased loved ones, are there for us and are guiding us. And that's a beautiful thing. It's something that's important about our lives and about facing trauma.
And we're going to turn over to the audience in just one sec here. The section on near-death experiences is absolutely fascinating because you take both a scientific and a skeptic's view of them both, and you present a lot of interesting cases and everything as well. Hal, we see your hand raised. Just go ahead and ask your question in the Q&A section down there at the bottom. The thing that I thought about when I was reading that is friends of mine who have had near-death experiences, and none of them have hovered over anything. My brother-in-law was dead for like 3 minutes, and I was like, "Did you see Nana? What was it like?" And he's like, "There was nothing. I saw nothing." And he's sort of a nihilist. Maggie, have you had a near-death experience that you wanted to talk about? Did you see anyone?
One time when I jumped out of an airplane, my parachute didn't open. And I had a moment where I had to cut away that parachute and go to my reserve. And it was like my mind could only focus on colors and shapes. Like I saw the ground was green and big, and then I looked up and saw the blue sky, but all I thought was blue. And then I saw the yellow of my reserve parachute opening. But at the same time, the song Slow Ride from Foghat was going through my head, and I consciously thought, I am not going to die to Foghat. Like I just won't let this happen. So that's as close as I've gotten to death. But I do have one last question for you before we turn it over to the Q&As, which is, I guess I feel kind of like a French existentialist minus the cigarettes these days, because I just feel like there's no point to anything. There's this ever-present fear of death hovering around me. So I'm like, why should I make the bed? Why should I do this? Like, how do we cultivate a sense of meaning when we aren't interacting with people or getting out in society and doing the things that would bring us joy?
Yeah, what we have to do, you know, you use the word pointless, and I've talked to a good friend of mine. He's been a friend for many years. I met him as an undergraduate, and we were talking about this, and we were sharing the idea or the thought that it's very hard to get motivated. If you had told me you're going to have months and months where you don't have to go in to teach, and I'm not actually teaching at all because I did all my courses in the fall and the winter, and you're not going to be running around and doing all the errands, you're just going to be at home, I would have thought, wow, I can get a lot of work done. I can write my next book. I can do all this stuff. And it turns out it's really hard to get motivated. And because there's a sense of pointlessness. And my friend felt the same. Of course, I do a lot of binge watching. But yeah, I think it can feel pointless. And actually, you know, it's funny because some philosophers think the fact that we're all going to die makes life pointless or meaningless. The fact that I'm eventually going to die, all my projects and loves, it will all end. That makes my life meaningless. And other people think, if I were to live forever, my life would then be meaningless because there wouldn't be a death to give it that meaning. I think that neither is right. I mean, I think that we live from our perspective here and now. And yes, eventually we will all die. And now that becomes very salient. People are having their lives cut off in horrible, arbitrary, unjust ways. And we feel, why should we invest ourselves in a project that could get cut off? Or, you know, no reason that we're in control of. But I think what we have to do is regroup and realize that we live in the moment. You know, we write the story or the narrative of our lives every day. Now, at the end, we might read it, reread it, and figure out what the meaning is. But what's important for us is that we pursue projects and find ways of getting out of ourselves. So this is what we're doing now. I'm talking to you, and I'm talking to Todd, and a couple hundred people are out there. We're reaching out, but we're doing it in a different way.
Well, you say something I think important in your book. So if you've forgotten what you said, I'll read it for you. You said that meaning in human life consists in part in being in contact with or engaged with something larger than oneself.
Yes,
I think that's a big thing. I mean, I'm not a terribly religious person either, but for part of my job, I have to read the Talmud a lot for a book I write. And you know, there's a great aphorism in the Talmud that says we live in deeds, not years.
Right.
And so when I'm feeling that sense of the pointlessness, I should just eat the gelato, even though I'm lactose intolerant. Like, I should choke to death in my sleep. What does it matter? I had the ice cream. I think about, I have so many things that I could do for other people. I have so many things that I want to share. There's so many people that I love that I want to see again. Right. And invariably, right, the fear of death is often not about the physical act of not existing. It's the pain that other people feel in your absence. If you're a narcissist like me, and you believe that everyone is going to miss you dramatically if you're
well, you're not really a narcissist if you care about their sadness then.
Right.
Yeah, no, well, let's see, oh yes. I would even put it this way, that meaningfulness, arguably at least, is a matter of making connections. making connections with truth and reality, not being deceived, not living like Plato's, the prisoners in Plato's cave who were looking at shadows, or not being deceived, or someone hooked you up to a virtual reality, or you're living in the matrix or something. We want to be connected to reality, and we want to be connected to others and to projects. Maybe your project is math or science, or maybe you follow an athletic team. What that's doing is connecting you not just to reality, but to others and to something bigger than yourself. It doesn't have to be God, though it could be. And so making connections, I think that's what meaningfulness is at a certain important level. And yes, Maggie, you're right, one of the depressing things about our lives now, both of you are pointing it out, we're stuck. We're like Sisyphus in a sense that we're stuck, but we're unlike him in that we have more resources to reach out and try and connect and to achieve solidarity. My wife and I often say, because, you hear this mantra on TV, alone together, or, but, and we'll make it together. But it is true. I feel a greater sense of community than I ever have. Mm-hmm. When I see people at the store wearing their masks, and when I just feel a togetherness that I've never really felt. So that's again, maybe that's the lesson of near-death experiences, that we're not alone in facing the worst challenges possible. Right. And when we're accompanied by someone we trust and love, that makes the terror go away, really.
It's the theme park of death experience that we're going to. So we've got a bunch of questions. So let us bring in our dear friend, Agam Patel. Agam, come on back, sir.
I'll try and be as fast as I can on
it. There's Agam with his virtual background. So Rupert, we see your hand raised. If you've got a question you haven't asked yet, Rupert, just type it into the Q&A section down there. So Agam is going to go through the questions, looking for ones we haven't obviously answered already. And is going to pose some questions. I think Agam got a haircut. Agam, did you get a haircut?
I didn't.
I went today for this special occasion.
Yeah, I have my COVID haircut, which is no haircut.
My wife bought clippers for our Cocker Spaniel, and today I decided we're going to try them on Todd.
Wow.
I feel pretty good. All right, Agam.
All right, the first one comes to us from Kevin Bethel. He's a UCR philosophy undergrad, and his question goes, in regards to the idea of creativity giving meaning in life, does it not seem that creativity alone is insufficient for giving value to a life? If Michelangelo painted beautiful masterpieces his whole life, and upon death they were destroyed, it would seem as though his exercising of creativity was of no value. Furthermore, if his creativity did not produce anything aesthetically beautiful, it would seem of no meaning. Do you believe that creativity alone has any value?
Yes, I believe. Very good, Kevin. Kevin, you've learned a lot in your philosophy classes with me. Very good question. But I think meaningfulness is enhanced by creativity. So it does have some value in itself. But it's not all we need, all we want. And leaving a lasting mark also, and influencing others and creating something, an accomplishment that's admired, that has value, but it's not everything. So I just think that creativity is an important element that's meaningfulness enhancing, but of course, if you add in the others, you get more. So that's, I agree with you that it's not sufficient all in itself, but it does, even if you struggle in not just strictly artistic endeavors, but let's say you're a scientist and you're very creative, you're very original in your ideas and creative, and you try and come up with a way of addressing a new virus or cancer or Alzheimer's, and you're wrong, and in the end, that's not something that works. Still, your life had tremendous value, even if others didn't learn from it. Your creativity in itself helps to make your life more meaningful, at least than it otherwise would have been. At least that's my view.
I mean, I think that's true. I mean, and the value to your own mental health in creating art.
Right.
You know, I will write things. I'm sure Maggie is the same way. We'll write things that will never see the light of day, but
Right.
by virtue of writing it, I feel less likely to go binge eat all the gelato.
I agree.
So folks that have your hands raised, just go ahead and write your question in the Q&A section, and we'll get to you. What's our next question, Agam?
All right, this one comes in from Max Neiman. If the existing generation were given the chance to live forever, but on the clear understanding that never again would there be a child or a youth or first love, never again new persons with new hopes, new ideas, new achievements, ourselves for always and never any others, could the answer be in doubt? Reaction?
Good. Very good. Yes. I happen to know the first two questioners, so this is fun. I think, yeah, you raised some great questions, and people, the immortality skeptics, raise many of these same questions. First of all, and many immortality scientists and optimists, Aubrey de Grey as an example, argue that we couldn't have children. If everyone were immortal, then people wouldn't be allowed to have children, because otherwise there would be the Malthusian population explosion. Now, would that be a desirable life? I'm not sure. If you were given the choice, if you were told you could live forever, and not only that, you wouldn't lose your loved ones. After all, losing a loved one is one of the worst things that can happen to you. And you would have relatively favorable environmental circumstances and so forth, but you couldn't have children. Or you could have children, but you're going to die, let's say, when, at the maximum age is 100. I'm not sure which people would choose. You would still be able to have a first love. You would still be able to meet new people, because there are going to be a lot of people. Assuming everyone is immortal, you'll be able to meet people. You'd still have first love. You could still have passion about projects. Things would be different, Max, very different. But I'm not totally convinced they'd be so different that we wouldn't find it attractive. But it's your point is well taken, that we shouldn't just blithely assume that it would be all rosy and peaches and cream. There would have to be all sorts of changes in our attitudes and in our relationships to children and families and the environment.
Okay. Excellent. What's next, Agam?
All right, this one comes from anonymous attendee. Technology changed the way we see and interact with each other. Holograms of dead singers, etc. What do you think about this notion of digital immortality?
Yeah, I'm not thrilled with it. Yes, there is. For instance, there's a cemetery, isn't there, in Hollywood, California, called Hollywood Forever, where they do have videos and of people who have passed away. And that's kind of interesting, because they can communicate in a certain way. I don't have a problem with that, but the idea that people have is that we could be uploaded to a cyborg, that we could be uploaded to software. All the contents of our minds or our brains can be, you can take a photo or a snapshot of all the information, and you could upload it to a computer and achieve a kind of immortality. I think that's really, it's implausible, because I don't think that it would still be me. I don't think I would be conscious. I don't think you would have an individual who could be active and do the kinds of active things that help to give meaning to our lives. So there's also the dystopian possibilities that often are ignored, but that are portrayed on shows like Black Mirror, where someone is uploaded and then tortured for forever. Right. Like that. So anyway, I'm not.
They come back bad.
I'm very skeptical about the desirability of uploading or achieving immortality in those ways.
Well, and you know, something that I have been experiencing just in this medium on Zoom with seeing our friends is it's not the same to see a video of a person that you love as it is to be near that person. Even if you don't touch that person, to be in the same room with them, there's a different sort of energy than just seeing them on your video screen. Yeah. And I suspect that I'm sure there's a question that says, you know, is life worth living without the people that we love? And
they all have to be immortal, or
they'd have to be immortal too.
Yeah.
But it leads me to think of something that I've thought about before, and I wrote somewhere at one point, which is that I didn't believe in an afterlife until I had fallen in love. And the chemical reaction of love alters your real and perceptual ideals of what life really is.
Uh-huh.
And I want to live forever, provided that my wife lives forever. If she doesn't live forever, I don't want to live forever.
Right. And so there are different models of immortality. This is one thing in the literature on immortality. A lot of it is science fiction, where people are exploring different kinds of stories. And one story would be the lone immortal, where it's just me. And you'd be lonely. I think it would be like Alina Macropolis. You would lose interest in life. Then you can imagine a small group of immortals, but then you have social injustice and inequality. That small group has all the benefits and a lot of the resources. It would be unstable and unjust. And now if everyone is immortal, there's the population issue, the problems with not being able to have children. So there are different things to sort out. I agree.
But so much fudge. I would eat so much fudge.
If you were immortal, you could eat fudge forever. And and presumably we would have solved the problems, the health problems that come from eating too
all
much.
That fudge. Lipitor would be out of business. All right, what else do you have there, Mr. Patel?
All right, this one comes to us from our friend and colleague, Catherine Henshaw.
Hi, Catherine.
Does the idea of immortality or a very long life appear in similar ways in non-Western cultures?
Interesting. Well, certainly one of the first discussions in literature of seeking immortality was in the Epic of Gilgamesh from Mesopotamia. Of course, that was a story of someone who lost a good friend and then went out to try and figure out how to achieve immortality, but he couldn't quite do it. And so it's part of what's sometimes called the wisdom narrative tradition, where people are pointing that it's overreaching or it's asking too much or it's not reasonable to ask for immortality. But you have, of course, certain traditions, and I don't want to oversimplify, but certain versions of Hinduism and Buddhism involve reincarnation and a certain kind of immortality through the cycles of life. So I think my own view is that in pretty much all cultures, Western, non-Western, there are ideas of living forever. Now, they may be different in their specifics, but there's one way of putting it is for all human beings throughout time in all cultures, there's this tension between, on the one hand, the drive to live forever, or the drive to be in some way immortal, maybe through a soul or maybe through a spirit that gets attached to different bodies through reincarnation. And so the drive to be immortal, or maybe just living forever by achieving it through medicine or diet. And then also, on the other hand, there's skepticism and the idea that it's freakish, or it would be not even a recognizably human life. So there's this tension between the positive and the negative views of immortality. And I think it's not just a Western thing.
Okay. Next one, we have time for a couple more questions.
All right, this is
questions we don't get to, by the way, They are all answered right here. Every single question you might have about life, death, and the afterlife in John's book, Death, Immortality, and the Meaning of Life. I bought this on a large corporate website that also sends me my Charmin in bulk now, but you can get it just anywhere. You might try bookshop.org, by the way. It's a great independent bookstore online.
Well, I want to thank you, Todd and Maggie, also for your engagement in my book. And your kind words, I really appreciate it.
Of course. All right, I got a couple more questions.
All right, this one is again from another anonymous attendee. What ethical issues could be associated with immortality? What ethical responsibilities would an immortal have if we ever achieved such a feat? Because if we are immortal, we might be tempted to just not give a damn about anything. We have no terror management, not to worry about those we care for, and find meaning.
Good.
AKA the life of Maggie Downs.
Yeah. Oh, no, I think ethics wouldn't go away. In some ways, our responsibilities would be greater because we have the opportunity now to help others and not to have to end our attempts to, let's say, solve poverty or hunger or cancer or heart disease. We have a lot of time to pursue those projects. And just because we all have achieved a kind of immortality and we're under relatively favorable circumstances, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't care about loneliness and depression and people and social injustice and all the things that make life less desirable. So I think that we can still have motivation to help others, even if we are immortal and others are immortal. Now, I perhaps the biggest ethical concern, I think, is resources. So that if a small group of people are immortal, then there's the ethical problem that it's unfair. They're the only ones who get this benefit. And if you open it up then to everyone, then there's the problem of depletion and exploitation of resources. So those are some of the social and ethical issues. Okay.
And I suppose, immortality does not mean you couldn't lose a foot.
No, right. Or you couldn't get diabetes, so you have to worry about that fudge, or you could have high cholesterol, though you're not going to die of the heart disease.
Right.
But
you're just be miserable
you could
forever.
Well, you can definitely be lonely, and you could be depressed, and you can be sick, or you could have injury. Maggie could be jumping out of the plane and she could break her leg. Maybe in the future we'll be able to cure or regenerate, the leg and cure diabetes, but you would still go through a period of suffering and you would need to address those problems. The ethical problems would be different though. And
this is what happens in every vampire movie, is that there's always a point where the vampire is sad because they're so lonely and everyone they've ever loved is gone.
Well, that's the vampire literature is a perfect example. Really, it's perfect that you bring it up here because vampires achieve immortality at the expense of others, drinking other people's blood. And so a small group of individuals who achieve immortality at the expense of others is morally problematic.
All right, we have time for one last question. We could stay here all night because none of us have anywhere we need to go, but we presume John might want to have dinner. Agam, give us one last good one, please, sir.
All right, this one comes to us from our graduate student in creative writing, Emmett Brown.
Hi, Emmett.
And yes, it says, on the subject of meaningfulness, many religious people hold the idea of God as the highest connection to meaningfulness or being a part of something beyond ourselves. Is there any one specific meaningfulness that is shown to lead to more mental health illness if we ignore it or if we don't believe in its existence?
Wow.
Is there any? I wasn't sure I got the question, but let me say this, that yes, one of the most obvious ways in which you could connect with something greater than yourself is to link with God, is to make that connection. And typically the idea the religious idea would be to fulfill God's purposes for us. God is supposed to, in the monotheistic Western perfect being tradition, God is a perfect being. And so his purposes for us guide us toward the ultimate kind of meaningfulness. And but my own view is that that's just one interpretation of connecting to something larger or greater than ourselves. It's a valid one. It's one that gives a lot of people hope and roots them and is a way of terror management. But there are other ways of connecting with something larger. Science, for instance, is an ongoing project, or art, or philosophy, or mathematics, or achieving something by working as a team in athletics. It's something, think about baseball. I find baseball rather boring, but the aficionados, the fans, love to share the statistics, and they look at the history. They look at this particular game as part of something bigger. So going back to that idea of making connections, one way to achieve meaningfulness is to make a connection. And making a connection with a perfect being, I guess, would be the ultimate kind of important connection. Mm-hmm. But there are other ways of making connections, connections with ongoing activities like science or literature or art or athletics, or simply making connections with others and loving them. That's another way of...
that thing that's larger than yourself, basically, like you talked about in the book. I mean, it seems to me to speak to Emmett's larger question, if someone doesn't have religion to fix the chaos in the world, what is the thing that keeps that person tethered to reality without spitting out and saying, oh, we're all going to die? And there has to be some belief in something. So even if you don't believe in God, you believe in love, or you believe in science, or you believe in the spaghetti monster, or whatever it might be. Everyone has a belief that grounds them to this reality, because if you don't, then you'll float off into space.
And think about this. Yeah, you go off in space. You're untethered. You don't have philosophical gravity. And one way of bringing this out, and I know we're running out of time, is some people think if you look at ourselves from the perspective of the universe, if you really zoom out, not using this technology of zooming, but in your mind, you zoom out and take this very abstract perspective, you'll see that we're just specks. We're mere specks. So how could our lives be meaningful? Now, other people have pointed out that, well, it wouldn't make us that much more meaningful if we were giant or huge, like the balloons in the Macy's Day Parade or something. But I think what people are getting at when they say we're mere specks is something about the lack of connection. Because if I'm a tiny speck, like one planet in the universe, the problem is all those planets are out of my reach, that I can't connect with them. And that's what gives us this feeling of lack of gravity and being untethered. So it's not that we're small, it's that what we really need and care about is connection and getting outside of ourselves.
Well, John, thank you so much for coming and visiting with me and Maggie and the 200 people who showed up with us today. We're sorry we couldn't get to every single question, but here's our promise. As soon as we're free again, we will invite John back to campus where he can do one of his great big talks. You can corner him in the parking lot all night long. He loves that. He's a big fan of being cornered. John's one of our favorites. We really appreciate you, John, coming and showing back up on Zoom. Again, his brand new book, Death, Immortality, and Meaning in Life. It's available from Oxford University Press. You can order it right now. It is absolutely fascinating. And I found it oddly reassuring in this time to read it. It felt really good. This show that we've done here today, we're going to have up as a podcast through our show that Maggie and I host every week, Open Book. We'll send that link out to everybody that has attended. So if you want to listen to this again or share it with your friends, you can do that. And we'll have the video available up on our Facebook page sometime very soon as well. I hope you come and join us next week when we're going to be joined by, I think she's next to me over here, Maggie Downs, whose brand new book, Braver Than You Think, comes out next Tuesday. You have it right there? There it is.
I do. Oh, yeah.
It is about the journey she took around the world to complete her mother's bucket list while she was dying of Alzheimer's. So it's going to be another happy book right here at UCR Palm Desert. We hope you all stay safe out there. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.